Hello everyone, welcome to my channel. I'm really excited to bring you today's video. If you enjoy my content, don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications. Let's get started. Sarah was leading an ordinary but peaceful life in a small American town. She would wake up early to go to work, spend her evenings with her family, and enjoy coffee with close friends on weekends. Simple yet precious habits. The time she spent doing her beloved job at the bookstore brought her genuine happiness. She had built a life with her husband John and their 10-year-old daughter Emily. One morning, as Sarah got out of bed, she felt an unusual weakness. After taking a few steps, her head started spinning. Without realizing that something was wrong, she continued, heading towards the kitchen. Suddenly, her feet became unsteady, as though the ground beneath her was shifting. At that moment, her vision began to darken. She felt a void inside, and then her entire body became paralyzed. She collapsed onto the floor, her arms and legs moving uncontrollably. The last thing she remembered before her eyes closed was the sound of her daughter Emily's voice. "Mom?" she called, but the voice grew more distant. After that moment, Sarah found herself in a hospital. As she slowly opened her eyes, everything around her seemed blurry and unfamiliar. A pain throbbed in her head, as though something inside her skull had broken. A doctor standing nearby calmly informed her that she had suffered a stroke and that there might be permanent damage to some areas of her body. However, the most frightening thing the doctor told Sarah was this: "There is serious damage to your brain. You've lost your memory." These words felt like her world had shattered in an instant. In her mind, there was an emptiness, a sense of uncertainty. She couldn't remember her past, nor did she know who she was. When she was brought to the hospital, no one knew anything about her past. When her husband John and daughter Emily entered the room, they smiled at her, but those smiles held no meaning for Sarah. The attention of these two unfamiliar people seemed like remnants from a foreign world. When John said, "I love you, Sarah," Sarah couldn't feel the weight or meaning of those words. Even the name felt foreign to her. Sarah, who was I? She began to wonder internally. She felt like a stranger to herself. Doctors could not predict whether Sarah's memory would improve. However, she was told that special therapies would be applied daily to help her regain her memories. There was a void in her mind, but no one knew what could fill that emptiness. The first few days were the darkest times for Sarah. When she looked at herself in the mirror, she saw the reflection of a lost person in her eyes. Understanding her own identity felt like relearning everything from the beginning. Everyone around her tried to explain her past, but with every moment she failed to recall. A deeper void was left. The stories people told her about her past felt like someone else's life. Feeling like a stranger in her own life weakened her more with every passing minute. Although Sarah began to physically recover, the emptiness in her mind made her feel lonelier each day. Her past, her memories, her identity, everything had been wiped away in an instant. No one could remind her of who she was or what had happened to her. The only thing she remembered was that living without knowing who the old Sarah was, and what she had, living in the uncertainty of it all, was like being reborn. But nothing would ever be the same again. When Sarah opened her eyes in the hospital room, everything was foreign. The lights made her head pain worse, but no matter what she did, she had to stay awake. For a moment, she only heard the silence. Then the door creaked open. A man walked in and looked at her with yellowed eyes. "I'm your husband, David," he said. But Sarah couldn't respond to the name. Those words echoed in her ears like they were in another language. For a moment, she had no idea who this man was. Husband, The word lost its meaning. This man was her husband, but what kind of husband was he? How close was he to her? Sarah didn't remember anything. David gazed patiently into Sarah's eyes and continued, "I love you, even if you don't remember, double quotes. Each of his sentences left a deep emptiness inside her. She felt nothing, as if she were watching someone else's life unfold. She couldn't recognize the man's face or his voice. David tried often to remind her of their past, of their little girl, of the places they had visited together on vacations. But nothing triggered any memories in Sarah's mind. Everything was blurry, distant, and faded. Her family and friends came and tried to remind her of her old life, but nothing was the same anymore. Everything that had once been familiar now remained a stranger. Over time, David and other family members patiently continued to remind Sarah, "Here's your favorite movie. Do you remember this? Our old house." But Sarah, faced with these reminders, that felt like they belonged to someone else, found herself alone. There was no space in her mind to embrace her past. She began spending her days in an empty void, forced to leave her past behind without fully understanding it. She couldn't even remember who she truly was. One day, sitting alone in her room and staring at the view outside the window, Sarah felt a small emotion deep in her heart. Perhaps there was meaning in life after all, but as she tried to figure out what that was, the dead shadows of the past followed her. She couldn't relate to anyone, not even her own name. When she closed her eyes, all that remained was emptiness. She couldn't form a real connection with anyone, and no one could remind her of her identity. Sarah had begun to relearn the world, but that old identity had vanished. Yes, the people around her tried to remind her of her old life, but no matter how hard they tried, they couldn't bring back her past. Rebuilding her life was like chasing something lost, and as Sarah couldn't figure out what that lost thing was, she faced a new stranger every day. During her early recovery in the hospital, Sarah lived in a void where everything had been erased. The days passed in repetitive moments. Every new morning, she found herself in someone else's life. However, over time, something began to change. In the depths of her memory, small rays of light started to appear, even though they were blurry. These lights reminded her of traces of something lost, but she didn't understand what it was. She only felt that something existed. One morning, when she was alone at home, Sarah found an old photo album. As she opened its dusty cover, the album contained memories of years gone by. The photographs were fragments of a journey that had encompassed every moment of Sarah's life. At first, she only saw blurry shapes and faces, but then, when she picked up one photo, she stopped. A little girl was smiling with her family in a sunny garden. That smile suddenly stirred something inside Sarah. Who was that little girl? Was it herself? There was a familiar sparkle in her eyes, but at that moment, it was just a trace, a clue, an attempt to remember. Sarah paused for a few seconds, looking at the photo. The little girl was smiling happily, and something was pulling her toward it. Suddenly, she heard a sound, a soft breeze, the scent of that garden, a child's laughter. But no matter how hard she tried, the memories didn't fully return. She still couldn't remember who she was or what she had experienced. Slowly, she closed the album, but that smile, that photo, continued to echo in her mind. A few days later, Sarah went for a walk. On an evening when the sun was about to set, while walking in the town park, an old scent began to remind her of something familiar. The mixed smell of grass, soil, and trees. For a moment, she felt like she could trace a clue from the depths of the past. She remembered the breaths she had taken while playing as a child, or perhaps the time spent with her parents during a picnic. But the memory was still unclear. The scent was only a part of it, a lost piece of a whole. At that moment, Sarah realized she was following the traces of her lost life. But the traces were always complicated. She didn't know which memory fragment to follow, which one was important. Little by little, things were falling into place, but a huge void still remained. While trying to find out who she was, she felt that everything was incomplete. Unfinished. One morning, she turned on an old radio in the house. A worn-out melody began to play, a soft, soothing tune. At that moment, another small memory came to life. The music had awakened another piece of her lost life. Perhaps it was the scent of food her mother had made when she was a child, or the peaceful times spent together at their old home at night. But at that moment, everything remained blurry. The melody reminded her of something, but that something, like a dream, was fading away, piece by piece. Although Sarah found small traces of her past, she still couldn't put them together to form a clear whole. The memories were slowly returning, but each piece belonged to a different time and place. Sounds, smells, images. Each was a fragment of a lost life, but no matter how hard she tried, Sarah couldn't piece all these fragments together, couldn't rebuild that lost life. She was simply standing behind a wall, waiting to reach her past. And this waiting became more complicated, with every passing day, creating a deeper void within her. Sarah, with each new day, tried to fill the gap between the lost pieces of her past. The first light of the day reminded her of her old habits. Making coffee in the morning, this simple act, strangely gave her a sense of peace. But after a while, the smell of coffee, instead of reminding her of her childhood or her mother's coffee, just remained as the scent of a stranger. Those old times spun around in her mind like a kind of dream. Every morning, when she opened her eyes, an old identity, an old life, awaited her, but none of them were reachable. Sarah struggled even with the simplest decisions at the beginning of a new day, deciding what clothes to wear, what to have for breakfast. How to behave. These seemingly small but significant moments made her feel like she was facing an entirely different world, as if she were a stranger. There was no trace left of the old Sarah, the one she recognized. She didn't know which path was right, how to build her life. As David continued to try to remind her of her old memories, a sense of frustration grew in Sarah's mind. No matter how hard she tried, it was impossible to reconstruct the fragmented and lost pieces of her past. David patiently continued telling her stories every day. He spoke about their family, their friends, their old life, showing her photographs. But no matter how much he told her, Sarah still felt the void. The past didn't belong to her. Finding that old woman seemed impossible. Nothing about Sarah's past emotionally made sense. Everything felt detached from her, like someone else's life. However, one day, a few weeks after leaving the hospital, Sarah had an epiphany. The attempt to find the missing piece of her old identity had become a form of enslavement. While everyone tried to remind her, she realized that she needed to make a fresh start. She began to see her past's absence as an opportunity to introduce herself to herself. Instead of being stuck in the past, she decided to shape her new identity. With her own hands, every day, she took small steps on the journey to rebuild her identity. One morning, David suggested a walk outside. At first, she resisted, but then she agreed. As she started walking, everything around her appeared fresh, giving Sarah a spark of inspiration. Nature, people, the town, everything felt unfamiliar, yet it also felt like a new, fresh beginning. She felt as though she was existing again in the world. In that moment, she realized that one could still exist without the missing piece of the past. Slowly, instead of trying to find the lost identity, she began to search for ways to recreate herself. As days went by, Sarah made small but important changes. She began to question her old habits. Instead, she created a new lifestyle. Small changes, like reading books, walking outside, and trying different foods, started to expand Sarah's world. She met new people and saw old town friends again. They were all strangers to her, but each one gave her the opportunity to get to know them again. One day, while sitting alone at a cafe, a group of people approached her and began to chat. The old Sarah would have been shy and withdrawn in such situations, but this new Sarah spoke with them comfortably. Her identity in life no longer felt like something completely detached from her, but something that was truly hers. One evening, David and Sarah were sitting together at the top of the town. Slowly, without looking back at her past, Sarah turned her gaze to the sky. "Maybe I don't need to find my old identity anymore," she said quietly. "Because no one recognizes me, I feel like I'm alone again. But in reality, this is freedom. Instead of attaching myself to something, I want to build my identity with my own hands." David smiled as he looked at Sarah. In that moment, something in Sarah's eyes changed. Every small step she took toward recreating who she was offering her a life far more valuable than her old identity. With each new morning, she was beginning to find her own way, instead of carrying the weight of her past. Sarah's healing process had become an intertwined struggle of both physical and emotional battles. The damage to her brain presented her with a new challenge every day. Taking small steps and managing the basic functions of daily life was much more complicated than chasing after the lost pieces of her past. Every morning, when she woke up, not knowing how she would perform the simple tasks she had done the day before, Sarah sank deeper into an inner void. One morning, when she was getting ready to go to the hospital, she struggled to arrange her things properly. At the same time, she couldn't zip up the zipper of her pants, and no matter how hard she tried, her hands were trembling. She couldn't remember those old skills, those familiar movements. Whenever she tried to go back to her old routines, everything felt as if she was looking at it from a foreign place. Her old habits seemed like a great destruction to Sarah. Finding her old self had become a difficult task. Her therapists tried to motivate her every day with different exercises. She worked hard to rebuild herself, having to learn new skills every day. Simple things that were natural for the old Sarah were now foreign to her. Writing something, following a recipe, walking around a room. Ordinary actions required great effort. The slow progress made it even harder for her. Every day, with each step forward, she hoped she would get closer to her old life, her old identity. But with every step, something was missing. Family members, especially David, tried to support her constantly. They went for walks together in the mornings, looking at old photos and trying to bring back memories. David patiently tried to help Sarah recall her old memories, but they always encountered something else lost. Sarah's memory sometimes offered only a small fragment, but even that fragment became a huge struggle. The hope of rediscovering her old identity motivated her, but at the same time, it created an inner void. While Sarah was trying to heal physically, she also had to fight a deep emotional void. Dealing with everything missing, with the constantly disappearing memories, she felt lost. Her old identity, the life she once knew, seemed to have been erased. Connecting with her past wasn't just about recovering her memory, it was about rebuilding her identity. But every memory she recalled was cut short by a sense of emptiness. Trying to find memories from her old life only led her deeper into a dead end. The more she tried to bring those memories back, the more her past seemed to abandon her. One day, during a therapy session, Sarah suddenly started crying. The tears released a pain that had been building inside her for years. A small child and an old photo had made Sarah painfully remember. "Is this me?" she asked, her eyes filled with tears. Her therapist silently responded, "Yes, that's you." But reclaiming the past isn't just about remembering it, it's about accepting it. In that moment, Sarah realized something else beyond the lost memories of her past. To truly find who she was, she needed to accept today, not her past. David continued to remind Sarah of her small steps of progress every day. By walking together in the garden of their old home, David showed Sarah how far she had come. "Taking a step is much more valuable than going back to the past," David said. "This journey is not just about remembering the past, but about starting again every day." During this slow healing process, Sarah learned to celebrate the small victories of each moment, instead of focusing on the voids of her past. Looking back only confronted her with a lost life. But every new day offered her a chance to rebuild herself, and this process led Sarah to be reborn, both physically and emotionally. By creating space for the missing pieces of her past, she allowed herself to rebuild from scratch. While trying to rediscover her identity, she eventually accepted that everything would take shape with time and patience. Years passed, but Sarah still carried traces of that old woman, filling the gaps in her mind, and moving forward a little more every day began to reconcile her with herself. While trying to make peace with her past, every step toward rediscovering an identity that once felt lost became a journey of discovery. Sarah had succeeded in piecing together the missing parts of her past. While she could never fully recover her old life, it no longer mattered. The gaps in her mind slowly gave way to acceptance and peace. Her family, especially David, had supported her with patience for years. In the beginning, no matter how much Sarah thanked them, she had felt a deep inner void due to the shame and frustration of not being able to remember her old life. But over time, she realized that the family bonds, their emotional support, were far more important than remembering the past. David's constant reminder, "You don't need to remember everything from the past. It's enough for us to know who you are," but became a turning point for Sarah. Identity was much more than the memories of the past. Identity was something that took shape in every moment, every decision, every step. In the early days, she kept getting stuck on the missing parts of her past. Every moment she couldn't recall felt like a loss. But over time, she began to understand that those lost moments did not define Sarah's identity. As Sarah made peace with her past, the gaps became less frightening and less important. Her past's voids no longer made her feel like a lost person, but rather a reborn one. It was a form of acceptance. She might never know what happened in the past, but deciding who she would be now and in the future was entirely up to her. With each day that Sarah began to recreate herself, she grew more confident. Slowly, accepting the missing pieces of her past, she began focusing on the future. Leaving her old identity behind, she took one step at a time to learn who she truly was. The time she spent with David and her family made her realize how strong she was and how complex life could be. Challenges, instead of breaking her, helped rebuild her. Sarah now focused not on the lost memories of her past, but on her present self and her potential for the future. One morning, when she went for a walk alone, she stopped in the park at the center of the town. In the past, walking in this park was something she did to clear her mind. But in that moment, she was walking here not only as part of old habits, but as part of her new identity. She may have lost her past, but the Sarah who existed today had successfully created a new identity. While the old woman had become a lost memory, a new one had been born. Sarah was no longer someone lost. She was a woman, moving forward, looking toward the future. David came up to her, placed his hand on her shoulder, and smiled. "You did it," he said. "Even without your old identity, you know who you are. The future is yours, Sarah." Sarah looked up and glanced around. Everything looked the same as before, but with one difference. She hadn't gotten stuck in the past. Instead of trying to rebuild the pieces of that old life, she had simply accepted them. Now, she was at peace with her new life and future. She had truly rediscovered who she was. "It's not about forgetting the past," Sarah said with a slight smile. "It's about making peace with it. And being here now helped me start over." Looking toward the future, Sarah felt a sense of trust and peace inside her. She no longer needed to remember everything. Knowing who she was had given her a strength that made everything else seem less important. She may have lost her past, but creating the future was completely in her hands. With every step, she was being reborn, and with each step, she moved closer to rebuilding her identity by merging the gaps of her past.